We must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
Huh? What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No collusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
What up, world? My name is Nils Meskils. I'm the leader of the Yaru Liberation Organization. And you're listening to my favorite podcast in the whole world, The AnteDote.
Yo, AnteDote Live. Jeremy Rothkushel, Greg McCarran. Sorry.
We're here.
Shout out to John Swinton for the cartoon intro. Shout out to Nils Meskils for the AnteDote intro. All right, we're trying to figure out this live stream thing. We're gonna play a couple calls here. All right, here we go. All right, what's the date today, Greg?
Today is December 9th.
You were always on it.
I'm used to not being on video. I always joke I have a perfect face for radio, so.
I like your dome piece, Greg.
Well,
maybe Jaleel will make some comments about your sideburns.
My non-existent sideburns.
Yo, check out these sideburns, dog.
I think he's referring to the Simpsons episode with all the baseball players where Mr. Burns, a bunch of Major League players played for Mr. Burns' team, and Don Mattingly had to cut off his sideburns and couldn't, from the New York Yankees, and he couldn't make the team because he wouldn't cut his sideburns off. So I don't know where it came from. I guess for a bit there when my hair was growing out longer, I guess he thought I had sideburns. So maybe I did.
Interesting.
Either way, I am perpetually shamed for not cutting off my sideburns.
I can't keep up with all you kids and all your cartoon shows.
Well, this is from 1990, for early 90s, so I'm actually too young to remember it. But.
Okay, so all right, so let's play some stuff here. We're first gonna play your C-SPAN call-in. I'm trying to make sure we don't have like the clicking sound that we once had that was so annoying. I don't know exactly what I'm doing here. I apologize.
And I guess we'll both just play our respective clips and analyze them as they relate to the current moment and some of the bigger dynamics that are at play right now and historically. So yes, let's do it. What you're about to play here shortly is a call I made into C-SPAN from Monday, November 30th, and this was a call related to the questions you can see on the screen. How has President Trump changed the Republican Party? And this was my call into C-SPAN on the morning of Monday, November 30th.
All right, let me make sure that this is going to play here. Greg, can you see everything?
I can see the screen with C-SPAN. Yes,
especially by Obama and his wife. You know, there's another word for black.
So this is the caller before you, right?
It's Anglophobe.
Yes.
Let's go to Kansas City Independent line. We'll hear from Greg. Go ahead.
Go, Greg, go.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call.
You bet.
I believe that Donald Trump represents the complete transformation, I believe, a long-term operation in making the GOP into a completely foreign-owned entity, and that's through a combination of Donald Trump being a long-term asset/agent of Russian interest going back at least to the late 1980s, and then also a long-term operation within the Republican Party that is engineered by people such as Paul Weyrich over the years, Council for National Policy, and cultivating a closer relationship with between the U.S. right wing and Russia, and then also combined with interests that are very close to the goals of Israel and the domestic Zionist lobby here in the United States, such as Breitbart and the Mercer Empire and all the things that they've funded over the years. So my belief is that now, with even the insertion of foreign money coming into the hands of people such as Lindsey Graham and Kevin McCarthy and Mitch McConnell, who were not initially completely 100% on board with all things Trump. I believe by the likes of Oleg Deripaska, Leonard Blavatnik, among others, I believe we have seen a complete transformation of the Republican Party into a completely foreign-owned entity. And I think that's what we're seeing now with all these politicians who have completely become obsequious to Trump, who were not initially on board with him in the first place.
This is the reporting of the...
Nice, Greg.
Yeah, so I was about, I I think I decided probably about 15 minutes before Washington Journal went on the air that morning I was going to call in on this topic, and to my surprise, I was very quick, succinct, and to the point. And you sense like you sense like almost like a willingness to try to cut this call. And as soon as I stopped talking for even a half second, he was ready to immediately move on. But I got the points I wanted to make out, and so I was very. I was very happy with that call, and I feel like I hit a number of points, as you said, is as as informative as C-SPAN can be at times. Topics that really never come up within that realm, or in very that don't really obviously don't come up nearly as much as you do, but concepts and names that are like never mentioned within like the within that realm. And some of the some of the people who are very I think some very combination of very serious policy people and people who consider themselves to be politically informed as far as current events go really do tune into that. So I was happy to get a call like that out into that into the taking advantage of what we've talked about before, of the valuable resource that is C-SPAN. I was very happy with that phone call, and I tried to in a 90-second span try to give somewhat of like what I see as like the full circle operation that's taken place within the Republican Party and within the right-wing power structure over the course of several decades. And you didn't get into everything, but I mentioned what I thought needed to be mentioned.
Oh yeah, and I definitely he flinched a little bit when you said Zionist. I saw that there was the move, but he laid off of it, and then I saw also that when you said the word obsequious, he sort of relaxed a little bit. Like any caller is using the word obsequious. I can't pull the call ending trigger on them in the middle of
And he
obsequious.
knows it's true about like Lindsey Graham too.
Oh yeah, and you really laid out the facts there, dude.
Well, I mean, it was I just said what and I think like even there, like when you make calls like that, I think you subconsciously realize things you already knew, but like they become a little more clear for you.
Oh
Like in the
yeah.
midst of making that call, like we were thinking about things, and we were even talking about the and this goes back to something else that we were talking among ourselves about the clip of Ron Paul back in during the 2008 presidential campaign, talking about how fascism, it was the Sinclair Lewis warning, fascism will come to America wrapped in a flag and carrying the cross. And even going through this clip and bringing up like the decades long operation by, as I mentioned, Paul Weyrich, founder of the Heritage Movement, one of the fathers of the New Right, as it's called, in the council, his leading role within the whole Council for National Policy Nexus, and the cultivating of the relationship between the New Right in America, the evangelicals, and moving closer to Russia in terms of this whole culture war. Like, even talking about that brings full circle, like what I've understood for the longest time is that, or my understanding, which has evolved over the last few years, is that the Christian evangelicals were simply subservient to Israel, and Christianity and traditional conservatism were being subverted by Israel, by the goals of the Zionist lobby, as I also mentioned in that phone call. But that is not a complete picture, because we really do need to take into consideration the Russian aspect of this operation, and it's very real, it's very significant, and I feel like it's been extremely underreported and underfocused on, even compared to the obvious, Israeli Zionist factor, which very much figures into the foreign policy aspect of things. But everything that's going on with the evangelical movement and the shifting of the Republican Party is not simply answered just by, neocon wars for Israel.
I like the title on this. How has President Trump changed the Republican Party? And you answered the question.
And the thing is, like, the Republican Party has obviously long been a controlled entity. I mean, you can go back to for decades upon decades now. But I think what we're seeing with we are seeing things with Trump that we did not see before. And I mentioned the Mercers and Breitbart, and I brought in the Zionist lobby aspect of it. But even that is bigger also than just Israel. And I mean, I think we'll have to lay this out some point in the future, Jeremy. But I think what we've seen, like, you can look at the more and more I look at this, I look at even the rise of the Tea Party as part of this. The Tea Party was not just some domestic operation that rose up. I see a ton of foreign influence, particularly of this, I would say, subversive multinational element that's really, I think, come to dominate the party. And it's very interesting because, as you know, Ron Paul was correct. Fascism will come to America wrapped in a flag and carrying the cross. But I didn't back when I was a Ron Paul supporter. I didn't foresee Ron Paul as being a direct like shill or mouthpiece for this operation. But you can see now with the way he defends all things Donald Trump, he was part of this. And it's interesting because Ron Paul goes back to the original Tea Party, the Tea Party prior to it really being subverted by the interests I'm talking about now, with the rise of the Tea Party and the Mercer Empire playing a very key role in that, even from the very beginning, with the even Steve Bannon giving Jim Hoft of the Gateway Pundit credit for organizing the first of the major Tea Party rallies in St. Louis in April of 2009. And that's something that really, really goes under the radar. And so I see the entire like rise of like this insurgent conservative movement. It began with the New Right. You can go back to Cold War era John Birch Society, that whole dynamic that played out with the rise of Barry Goldwater and but then evolving into the New Right Council for National Policy. And then most recently with the rise of the Tea Party and ultimately I think like the fruits of the Tea Party's labor was ultimately bringing in President Donald Trump and all that we're seeing play out now. That's kind of a brief explanation for, I think, something that really should be talked about more in depth in the future. But I do think that we're seeing the culmination of a long-term operation on multiple fronts to really make the GOP a foreign-owned property, and it's under it's that whole what Ron Paul talked about. It's under the guise of patriotism. The people who are the loudest about patriotism and American values and Christian values are the ones that are actually really some of the most subversive elements of all.
Oh yeah, I mean, knowing what we know now about the NRA, for example. You see the era. You go back to see the era of the Tea Party, as you said, and then to see that together, the NRA and the Tea Party, and then going back to what's her name, Lois? What was her name? Lois Lerner. What was her name?
Lois Lerner was the she was the head of was she the head of the IRS in the Obama administration?
Yes.
And I kept hearing about the politically targeted, the political targeting of the Tea Party movement. And the way it was made out was like, it's not just it's an attack on regular, everyday conservative Americans, right?
Yeah.
Looking back with the benefit of hindsight, I'd have to go back and look at this. I'd have to go back and look at some of the stories that were out about it at the time. But like, I could even sense, and this is an opinion that not everybody in our, maybe not even everybody in our sphere of influence would like to hear, but I could even sense, like, I think it would make sense to me if there were people who saw like this operation at play and coming to fruition who really sought to attempt to nip it in the bud at some level or another. And that wouldn't, and so I think, you've got to take like you've got to advance your mindset and perspective on this to look just outside of like the way like the obvious bad operative controlled reactionary media paints it out to be as just an attack on everyday citizens, and perhaps expand your thinking on it a little bit, because all may not be the case with that. And so I think you could make a case where we're seeing all the fruits of the Tea Party's labor, so to speak, and what's come out of that. And I do think that you could make a case that some people may have been onto something and really trying to like nip this political movement in the bud, but it's all under the guise of populism and representing the little man, when in reality it's just another cog in a long-term operation to contribute to and assist in the destabilizing and undermining of this country. And so,
I mean, it would be interesting to go back to see what was all related to that tax investigation into the Tea Party, the associated network. I mean, now what we know, I'm sure some people will just write it off as like the Democrat Attorney General of New York doing investigations into the NRA Nothing Burger. But it's not an NRA Nothing Burger. On all the layers, you can see there's something very real there, from their trip to Russia with Sheriff Clark. Wasn't that an NRA trip that Sheriff Clark went on?
I believe
I
it
think
was.
so. And remember, even what's her name? What's it said to be like by the Aaron Montes, the nothing burger Russian spy. What's her name? All hooked up there with
yes,
with
the Russia trip was,
torsion.
yeah, no, the Maria Butina will be who you're referring to. And by the way, there's still questions of Maria Butina's attempted financial dealings with Maurice Hank Greenberg as well.
And torsion. Yeah, and
Yes.
and she went to Israel also. So that's interesting. And she was a gun rights activist. That's sort of how she got into the scene, right? As a gun rights activist, making the connection between the NRA scene in the U.S. and back to the what's his name, Serkovian gun rights associations in Russia.
And Butina is cultivating the relationship with David Kean, who was a two-time president of the National Rifle Association, in addition to being the opinion page editor of the Washington Times. And also something else to think about in this regard is all of this Tea Party tax investigations would have been post Citizens United ruling as well.
Right.
So
right.
there could be something to that.
Citizens United at the epicenter of a bunch of stuff here.
Yeah, just make it clear, we're not saying one way or the other this is what's going on. It's just something to consider in terms of things that may or may not be happening. Outside of what we see on the surface.
For sure, and what can definitely be said is that the Trump movement is Tea Party 2.0. And MAGA, you could say, is Tea Party 2.0, and then QAnon is the 3.0, basically, of that escalation of hybrid warfare. And looking back on it, it seems now fairly natural that it was taken out of, the conspiracy movement and 9/11 Truth and the throwing of the fraudulent 9/11 documents into Boston Harbor, and then sort of taken into the Ron Paul sort of libertarian washed, and then, as you said, into the through the gateway of the pundit who was sitting at the table with Breitbart and Netanyahu in terms of Jim Hoft and all of that, and then through these and of course Hoft is a character who's still there today. He basically took that through all of its iterations. I think he's probably fairly gentle in the way that he plays with QAnon. But he probably holds that whole sphere from Tea Party to MAGA to Q as a coordinated hybrid warfare network together.
Gateway, regardless of whether Gateway Pundit is QAnon affiliated or not, Gateway Pundit has definitely helped lead the way in some of the more out there, but also more influential narratives that really take a hold within a significant portion of the base, as well as helping lead the way in making a lot of the narrative we hear that do sometimes cross over not only into QAnon lines, but also into some of the quote mainstream lines. Really major influential outlet in cultivating and making sure those narratives are spread out into the rest of the right-wing media sphere, so to speak. And I think now with the rise of the reaction to the election, you're seeing a lot of you do see a lot of overlap between overt QAnon and the other elements of the right-wing movement that are not willing to directly associate with QAnon, or even in some cases want to have nothing to do with QAnon. We've seen overlap here before, but now even with even taken outside of the noise of like the infighting between the party operatives and the Sidney Powell, Lynn Wood, that whole thing about they're actually rhinos or whatever, or Newt Gingrich is now deep state because he shills for everything Trump, but he criticized MAGA hero Lynn Wood. Taking all that out of consideration, you see a lot of overlap because none of them will because they all, for the most part, are parodying some form or variation of the stolen election narrative. And this is very interesting. I just found this out that Texas has led the way in terms of this multi-state effort to challenge the election results at the state level. Turns out the head of the Texas Republican Party, as of July, is one of the one of the foremost original Tea Party congressional heroes now would be Allen West, Lieutenant Colonel Allen West, the war
Alan
hero.
West.
And so Allen West is leading the Republican Party in Texas, and Texas is leading the way in this multi-state effort to not accept the election results at a state level. And so that right there is just one example of like the fruition in the form of, and to me it seems like, I'll just lay this out real quick. I was a Ron Paul supporter. I was actually a state alternate delegate at the Missouri Republican Convention in 2012. I briefly joined the Jackson County, Missouri, Kansas City area Republican Party. And then I very quickly got disenchanted and got out of it, and I don't regret it. But what I think was going on at this point, I think the Ron Paul movement was a key part of this, was I think at the state level, I believe between a combination of Tea Party political interest and judges on a state level, federal level, that are very much vetted through and approved by, we've talked a bit about this before, the Federalist Society and organizations like that. It seems to me almost like, and I think you're seeing this at the state level now with this election with this latest move playing out, is I think that these elements have taken over a lot of these Republican, and I dismiss the importance of like state and local politics in the past, but it seems to me now like there's been at the very least some very strong influence, if not a complete takeover of a lot of these states at the state level by these elements we're talking about right now.
Oh yeah, yeah, and this is interesting. This is, to me, this Texas play to the Supreme Court seems like the big last push here, and we'll see if it goes anywhere. It seems, it's interesting. Like I could see where it could potentially go somewhere, because it has to do. It's the most direct route to the Supreme Court, because it's very obviously a federal question, whether or not it's a legitimate question. But because they're in the game, they have all these amici briefs filed by other states, including Missouri. You guys are in it. Your Attorney General Schmidt is actually leading the way. Actually, right? Isn't he the one? He's leading the amici filers actually in that Texas lawsuit that you're referring to, Greg, around the elections. Is Attorney General Schmidt in Missouri. And then we have our own Attorney General Schmidt here in Kansas, who it's spelled a different way, Derek Schmidt, and he's also signed on to this.
TT and DT, I believe, are the differences in the name. One is SCHMITT, and the other is SCHMIDT. And, I talked about this in our last recording that we put out over the weekend, but even, I've said this, and like, I believe this more and more every day, that like, even if nothing happens per se between now and January 20th, like short term and long term, we're not out of the woods by any stretch of the imagination, because we were talking about this before, between even moving beyond just the state political level, but even at the federal level. I mean, you've got this one congressman from Alabama, Mo Brooks, who is vowing to challenge even like an electoral college certification of Biden's victory. He's not publicly being joined by any other members of Congress who are publicly going to sign on to this, but at a federal level, there's very, very little pushback against like the open challenging of the election results and all that it means for our system and everything. I mean, I pointed out the two examples in the Senate and House respectively, just two of many examples, but Lindsey Graham and Jim Jordan. And the way like these politicians from a state level to a federal level are responding to this is unprecedented in the history of our party politics. And everybody likes to talk about how, well, the Democrats didn't accept Trump's victory, like they never accepted him. But there was nothing even close to this coming from any factors of the Democratic establishment. You had a little bit of noise made within the, a few isolated, a few members of Congress. But I mean, they were even quickly shut down even by the Democratic Party. But like, the way like the party is responding in general, this is another example of like this takeover by this particular sector of interest, is that just the level of pushback is is almost non-existent outside of maybe even like a token voice like a Mitt Romney. And there's even some interesting things about Mitt Romney we'll have to go into the future at some point, but it's almost non-existent. And I think that's very telling, and I think it's very significant to say the least. And so at the very least, we're setting up for a large portion of the population to not accept the results. And it terrifies me as to what could be justified in the name of that. And also the fact that the institutions that were supposed to hold this accountable from the beginning and not allow the rise of a Trump-like figure to power, still really doing nothing to actually shed real light on the nature of the situation, both the moment and of the operation which led to all of this.
Yeah, well, we'll see where this goes and what the where the investigations go in all of this. I mean, it feels like it's being set up. I mean, maybe there's a big push here, like a kind of, you know, an embedded coup d'état because he's already in office. But this is a big deal for these state attorney generals to push the way towards invalidating the election at the Supreme Court level and filing amici briefs, and it's a bunch of them. It's like Missouri and Kansas and who else? Arizona.
I believe 17 states.
Yeah. So we will see. I mean, Trump still seems to be involved in magical thinking about how the Amy Coney Barrett by herself can overthrow the election with the help of Sam Alito or something like that. But I don't think, I think that a lot of this is for show, which doesn't mean that it's less dangerous. It's probably more dangerous actually, because as we talked about in our last recording, Greg, that similarly the way that Obama came in to, this 1.0 as we're talking about, Tea Party, all of that, the weaponization of the birther stuff too. Remember Trump being a key part of that. I pointed it out over and over that I actually believe that was another weaponization of a real inquiry, in the same way that like the inquiry into election fraud is a weaponization of a real inquiry, such as the focus by Powell onto Dominion against ES&S and Hart Intercivic. It's interesting. This is, and I believe I said that when we recorded, I talked about how Texas, in an election integrity perspective, is made totally of ES&S combined with Hart Intercivic. There's no Dominion machines in Texas.
Dominion voting systems. China. Dominion. China.
True. It's sort of wild. So I guess we'll see what happens with this. I had a brief run-in with Derek Schmidt, our attorney general here in Kansas, at the Dole Institute about a year ago, and asked him about the anti-boycott divestment sanction laws that had been passed in Kansas. But what's interesting is that the point I made to him was, all right, he's the attorney general. Of course, he has to defend the laws. When a Mennonite math teacher here in Kansas refused to sign her Israel loyalty pledge just to be a math teacher to be paid by the state of Kansas. And because the Mennonites, especially in this area, are working very hard in terms of boycott, divestment, sanction. And so she then joined up. I think she took on the ACLU, and they took it to the federal level and got it pushed back. And then it went back to the state legislature, where this seems to be a playbook that we will deal with at some point, about the anti-BDS laws, where they started out where it's basically will affect the individual, because it's basically any person who can be considered like a contractor at whatever level. They don't have to be a big corporation. They can then be held to sign this Israel loyalty pledge in relationship to the Palestinian Solidarity and BDS. And so Schmidt defended that law against her name's Esther Kuntz, is the name of the Mennonite math teacher, and they won. But then what I noticed was that he led the way on filing an amici brief, I think an amicus brief, to support Arizona's state law. And so my point to him was, why does it make sense, to be supporting some other state's law about this thing? And he basically, he had a good answer. He said that he believed that it was in Kansas's interests in order to help other states defend similar types of laws. But the bigger picture here, of course, and we pointed this out in our recording, is that as the potential Biden administration comes in, and it's going to be heavily the return to the establishment Zionist American empire in many ways. This question of the frontal question of Israel supremacy in the United States in terms of their assertion at the state level. And go look at the work that Grant Smith is doing at the Institute for Research on Middle East Policy in terms of the state level that they are operating in terms of the binational fusion of the United States and Israel. And we pointed this out when Ratcliffe was originally being talked about to become the director of national intelligence, that he had been crucial to introducing a bill to create a center of excellence that was in Israel and some kind of conjunction operation. And this is really what you go look at is that Paul Singer, who helped start this whole corporate marketing of Israel, the startup nation, right? What's his name? Dan Senor.
Dan Senor.
And Saul Singer. And I don't know if not sure whether this Saul Singer is related to Paul Singer. And remember, isn't Paul Singer also the one was behind the original payment for the Trump dossier via
that was Paul Singer? Yes,
that is very interesting, and we've hypothesized that was not just to take down Trump. That was to get the goods on Trump.
Yeah, and that's where there's some potential misunderstandings with relation to a lot of that from people, but I don't know if they're related or not. But Paul Singer.
Yeah, but for sure, Paul Singer was behind the creation of the startup nation, the whole thing, and that the reason behind it.
Written pretty extensively about Paul Singer's role with what you're talking about here.
What'd you say?
I think Whitney Webb's written pretty significantly about Paul Singer's role in all of this.
Yes,
primary role, leading role.
That was a crucial article that she wrote last year, I think, early 2019, was specifically about that, and pointing out that the linkage was overt around boycott, divestment, sanction, in the same way that Netanyahu publicly said, if you decide to boycott us, we're going to boycott you. He meant that, of course, in a very deep way. And of course, what we're seeing now is very recently, the Citizens Lab, I think it's called, put out a new report just a few days ago, actually, about it's the parallel to the NSO group Pegasus software, cyber weaponry that was used against activists and really investigators in Mexico. What they were investigating was the disappearance of the dozens of children. This technology got into the hands of the drug cartels in Mexico. The Mexican government was totally teamed up with this Israeli military intelligence software to target their political enemies. And that software was basically an owning of a smartphone, and it required someone to click on a dirty link, basically, that would then own their phone and gather all of the data, be able to own all of the stuff in their phone. But this newest situation is basically they're reporting on Circles. Circles is basically a follow-up in many ways. And what it looks like is it can be much more expansive in many ways, because it takes advantage of the old school SMS cellular connection capacity, and people should go look at this article. I forget what it's called, Going in Circles or something, and it basically points out, and this is Talpiot on display hardcore, is that this Circles software was using Checkpoint, created by a Talpiot member, I believe, originally. And even, as we pointed out before, that even someone like the former head of Jewish Voice for Peace, I can't Rebecca Vilcomerson, that her husband works at Checkpoint Software. But Checkpoint was the hardware where this Circle software hooked into, which could then become a very strong man in the middle player between people and their phones ultimately. And remember, this is at the epicenter of hacking Khashoggi, setting Khashoggi up for assassination, but even someone all the way up to like Jeff Bezos, which is interesting. Yeah. Let's put that back into context in terms of Jedi Cloud, Joint Enterprise Defense Infrastructure, with Microsoft, bringing in Autolome, Unit A200, 3 Talpiot program members heading Autolome, bringing Autolome into Microsoft to head up their cloud app security division, really. And then it looks like Amazon Web Services, basically cloud, Jeff Bezos' own cloud, is the front runner for the Pentagon cloud infrastructure. And then at the last moment, it's shifted over to Microsoft. And so then thinking about the targeting of Bezos via, with the Saudi cutout, but Israeli military intelligence, obvious, it's their software, this Pegasus software that was used to target him. So I think there's something to that, actually.
Definitely something to that. And it should go without saying, like, that's not a defense in any way, shape, or form of Jeff Bezos or the Washington Post. But,
no.
Two things can simultaneously be true. And I think a lot of the time people forget that two things can be true. Jeff Bezos could be a terrible influence on our society with his billions and all the things he's doing, all the things Amazon's doing. But at the same time, there's a lot of political targeting of the Amazon Bezos interests by this particular group of people. And so, I mean, two things can be true at the same time, and we got to remember that and take that into consideration.
Of course, someone chose George W. Bush in the middle of the Israeli constructed Iraq war for the United States, being pitched by all of these, Americans who were playing the role of Israeli partisans. Someone chose George W. Bush to steal the election for, rather than John Kerry. Just the same as someone chose Bill Gates, Microsoft, made in Israel, Windows, and their Autolome newly incorporated Talpiot, Azure Cloud App Security, rather than the Jeff Bezos. It means nothing about a moral evaluation or an economic evaluation or political evaluation about Jeff Bezos to point out that obvious point.
It's interesting. How many times in the nonstop criticism of Bill Gates have you ever heard this mentioned in reference to him?
Yeah.
And real quick, going back to the BDS and what you talked about, even with the effect it has on individuals and on contractors, private contractors, individual contractors. Abby Martin's case against the state of Georgia is a perfect example of this, and she's laid that out recently. I think she provided some recent updates on her case in Georgia, but her being barred from speaking at I believe it was Georgia State University due to the criticism of Israel and state laws.
She wasn't barred from speaking there. She chose not to because she chose not to do the same thing Esther Kuntz did, where she decided not to sign the loyalty oath in order to speak there. Yeah.
But it affected her ability as an individual to
get paid to do this. Yes.
And so it's obviously vitally important. And that would also be something in the future to watch, because this is just bringing up something in potential Biden administration, is that I think that there could very well be a push by bad actors to portray, justify crackdowns from a liberal American Zionist establishment perspective to justify crackdowns on something like BDS as calling it like a Russian propaganda movement. So watch for that as well.
Oh yeah. Perhaps. For sure. And it will be weaponized as such also. So those both will be true. And once again, two things can be true at the same time.
These require serious conversations about these topics. Where on one hand, understanding the why any types of is a problem, but at the same time understanding both short-term and long-term weaponizing of things such as the discourse on issues such as Palestinian rights and the bigger international, foreign policy, geopolitical perspective on the conflicts in the Middle East as well. So there's a lot to unpeel, and these are not black
For
and white
sure.
issues. They're nuanced and much more complicated than they appear to be on the surface.
It's really interesting also with Abby's cases because her case, I think, is really exposing what I was talking about before about how there is an architecture to the move that the Israel lobby and the Israeli government is doing in relationship to these laws. And it does look like it's a tyrannical creep of some sort where they'll go 2 steps forward, take a step backwards. They basically go to this place that's obviously unconstitutional, as they found in the Esther Kuntz case, where the federal judge basically says it's unconstitutional on the surface, and then they go back to the realm, and you could see it is in the realm of Citizens United, basically, that, and I've heard some fairly convincing legal justification for why the state, for example, because it's not, early on it was there was a lot of people like Glenn Greenwald, I think, actually is what sticks in my mind, of people who were basically directly associating with these laws, these anti-BDS laws, as basically it's going to be illegal to engage in the boycott, or it's going to be illegal to speak against Israel. And it's obviously that's not the case. This is much more in the realm of the way, for example, the way that things like vaccines are coerced rather than mandated. It's that kind of thing where basically, like you pointed out, Greg, that that in Georgia, Abby Martin was prevented from getting her speaking fees from the state of Georgia, ultimately through the university, is the way that the law works in that way as an individual contractor. But she wasn't in threat of being arrested or not being allowed to speak. She could have gone actually probably and spoken for free, and nothing would have happened. They just couldn't have paid her. But it is an interesting bigger point here that there is this tyrannical creep, because the bigger piece behind this is they're actually not so worried about individuals having the right to speak. Eventually, maybe it's heading in that direction. And they definitely will target individuals in terms of lawfare and social pressure, but especially like Palestinians specifically, and Palestinian professors, people like Stephen Saleta, where they'll actually try to like drive them out of their positions. But, the First Amendment, it protects actual public speech. It doesn't guarantee that you can get paid by states or by corporate entities in order to have that speech. So that's been one thing here, and I've seen it credibly stated that the states can make a credible, convincing case that their economic relationship with Israel is important enough that they can at least put a limit on their relationship with bigger contractors. I think it's on the edge of seditious, potentially, in terms of its intent, but it's also directly treasonous if you incorporate the Israeli government's role in things like September 11th, terrorism, but obviously the architecture of sedition in the wake of it. However, as a singular issue, it is interesting that groups that disagree with boycott, divestment, sanction have jumped into Abby's case as amici briefers, I think, including J Street. It shows at the very least, maybe it's not totally good faith, but at the very least, they know it's bad politics for the Israeli government to come out in direct support of seditious adjacent behavior in the United States of America.
It shows, I think, at some level, it does show at some level at the very least, it's pushback against some of the more harder line elements of the political Zionist movement here in the U.S. and also the extreme and also the shifting overall in terms of like the shifting to the more hardline right-wing element of I think the Israeli government and also of the obviously of the many of the people here domestically who want to continue this shift of the I think it shows also, Jeremy, this would be something like this would be an interesting conversation to have also at some point in the future. I think it's an interesting topic as far as even like reactions of by large aspects of the American Jewish community to this shift in the more rightward hardline direction and all things related to all things Israel and Zionism. And if there's a global conversation to be had about that, and that even I think even could be have had a further conversation in like the way like the the government, even like the right wing government in Israel, does not want to completely alienate whatever vestiges of democratic support for Israel, serious democratic support for Israel, there still is left in the U.S. via being seen as like too much into this one direction. I think even things like some of these anti-BDS legislations are really seen as going in that direction, especially even also with the I think with the larger portion of the more liberal-minded, particularly progressive elements of the Democratic Party is naturally being allied with the people who are the underdogs in this whole fight, in with regards domestically as well as in the Middle East, particularly in Israel, and so there's a lot of power dynamics to it would be worth analyzing with relation to all this.
Oh yeah. I mean that it's a good point, Greg. I think that this will become more and more front and center to dissect the politics of the the liberal Israel lobby in the United States. I think there's some background that we did when we did a show about Obama,
Yes.
Obama's presidency, specifically in relationship to Israel and the Zionist power configuration. And I think there's definitely at the very least at the level of the individual Jewish community, there's definitely good faith in terms of being aligned with what you're talking about, human rights. If you go back even to the question of the Iraq War and that thing that we were talking about on our show recording about the Israel Project, using Frank Luntz, Wexner, and the Israel Project doing, analysis of PR. Basically, I think they found, or maybe it's in the Israel Lobby book. Yeah, I think it's actually in the Israel Lobby book that talks about how, because they of course, Mearsheimer and Walt were very sensitive to being called anti-Semites. I think Mearsheimer's part Jewish ethnically anyway. So, and he sort of shied away a little bit from the accusations and frontally talking about his Jewishness, but he would mention it every so often. But they made it very front and center that they were talking political power, and so in so doing, they went out of their way to show that the Jewish American community actually overclocked in relationship to way overclocked in relationship to its opposition to the Iraq War than the average American did. So that's interesting, and that fits in with what you were talking about in terms of the liberal Zionist community, and becoming more and more uncomfortable as Israel is exposed as not only an ethnocentric but really an ethno-supremacist state. And then on top of that, the question of the global terrorism, the technology domination. But then, as you tried to talk to Bernie Sanders about on the campaign trail in Iowa, this very strange so-called, it's not that strange, you can see exactly what's going on with it, with this autocratic, this authoritarian network that seems to link up the people who play with the anti-Semites directly with the heart of the Netanyahu's Israeli government, and with a very strong axis between Putin and Netanyahu. And so as that becomes more and more obvious, even the liberal Zionists, who have been largely historically very strongly driven by their Jewish politics, if not their Jewish religion, but their Jewish politics and their allegiance to defending Israel. More and more, that's becoming a real like a cognitive dissonance at a very high level, I think, to see the way that Netanyahu is in bed with all of these other factors that seem to be directly supporting the actual, anti-Jewish forces on the ground. So it began, but all this makes sense if you go look at history and you look at the actual, you know, Zionist leadership in the United States of America, as FDR is tasking his people to see how many potential Jewish European refugees they can bring in the midst of the chaos of World War II and the violence and destruction all around there. They were trying to figure out, FDR was trying to figure out, how many Jewish refugees can we take in? And his I can't remember the guy's name. I'll try to figure out the history. I have a few books that talk about this, but he went to talk to the Zionist Jewish leadership in the United States of America, and they considered him a traitor for trying to save the Jewish lives in a European context, because Israel was so much more important. And we've talked about that some in the past on the AnteDote, about that whole deep, situation going on. But there's a lot there.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of history repeating itself, and there's a long sorted tangled web relationship between like the hardline Zionists and like the actual what you might call right wing Western, American European centric. What people may use the term fascist authoritarian definitely to describe them, as it's played out in the relationships with people like Viktor Orban, or even the alternative for Deutschland Party in Germany, where I believe even the Israeli prosecutor who prosecuted Adolf Eichmann, who was supporting the alternative for Deutschland Party, and he came under a lot of fire for it.
I don't remember that. I don't remember that.
I'm going to look that up real quick as I keep talking here. But this whole thing with relation to the long-term dynamics of this right now in this current moment with the pushback you might be seeing, the pushback you're seeing on domestic level, I think within aspects of the American Jewish population, as well as the more liberal leaning, certainly progressive leaning segments of the population here domestically, is this is I think even the I think this is seen by some as a threat against this what you talked about, the American liberal Zionist establishment, which really I think came to fruition it looks like in the 60s, right around the time of coinciding with the civil rights movement, and we talked about before the shifting of the neoconservatives, which was largely arisen as a combination of support for Israel with the discomfort with with some of the aims and goals of the domestic civil rights, anti-war causes. But I think even now, where I think this is catching up with a lot of the liberal intelligentsia establishment, that very, very pro-Israel section of the American establishment that really had their feelings solidified by the wars of the 1960s and 67 war, 73 war. And now I think that's really like there's a serious moment there with a rising sentiment of more and more as your population moves more liberal leaning in certain areas. I think also this is a rise of also more diverse populace as well, is that these are the consequences of it, is that support for things like bipartisan support for Israel and all of it is not going to be as cut and dry anymore. And I think even there was a preemptive effort to, I think, really focus on this with some of the more Zionist centric elements that took advantage of things such as things like the Brexit vote in Europe and a lot of these domestic European movements that have risen, because even lukewarm milquetoast, to quote, opposition from the European Union and EU countries, which really doesn't actually do anything to actually seriously affect Israel's the levers of power in that region as far as like Israel's influence and as a dominant force in the region. Even lukewarm slaps on the wrist of rhetorical criticism of treatment of the Palestinians, it really doesn't go anywhere, is seen as a threat by these more rabid hardline elements. And so that's something that's been at play here for a while that I think's really that moment of like a serious domestic clash. I think it's been going on for a while now, but it seems to be coming to a head. And I think you're even seeing elements of that with the way these foreign policy establishment, even people as influential as John Brennan, openly condemning the assassination of the Iranian nuclear scientist.
He called it state-sponsored terrorism.
State-sponsored terrorism, which is like something you don't hear from.
I guess he put it in. He's like, if it is what it looks like, it would be considered state-sponsored terrorism.
Yes, indeed. And so that's something that, like, by the way, I found the name. Rafi Eitan is the Rafi Eitan released a video in support of the Alternative for Deutschland. And Rafi Eitan
was the operative who went and got him, but he didn't put him on trial. Yeah.
Well, yes, he headed the operation to capture
Eichmann. Yeah.
Yes, and he filmed a video in support of the Alternative for Deutschland party. And of course, they'll defend themselves by saying, well, we're not anti-Semitic. We love Israel. You know, it's the Sebastian Gorka defense. You know, my father was a European fascist, but I love Israel. But like but right there, they indirectly play into the at least at the very least, they play into the tropes, much like Viktor Orban does.
Well, of course, this is the core of Zionism. This is the core of the origins of the Zionism that actually became Israel and the modern Jewish terrorist state. Really, I mean, this is exactly the way that they talked about it. They were always willing to sacrifice a Jewish life, an individual Jewish life, or Jewish life to Jewish state, to Jewish homeland, to Jewish power. That was always there. It was not only they were willing to, they were going to, and they did. And they also, Jabotinsky, that whole background, Herzl, they all talked about that they were creating they were going to use the anti-Semites, that the anti-Semites were actually their key allies, and that they at some level believed that they had to create a new project, and that it was going to be dependent on anti-Semitism per se. And so, as the actual predominance of anti-Semitism per se against Jewish individuals goes down over time. Mm-hmm. Oh, did my camera went out? Sorry. I'll try to bring it back up. But as that goes down, then of course that kind of project is going to be dependent on manufacturing it, catalyzing it, working with it, and it becomes so obvious in the era of Trump, and that's what we picked up on almost immediately, was this horseshoe, the alt-right, the alt-light, but Netanyahu's down with it all.
And it appears another foreign actor in the state of Russia is down with it too at the end of the day as well. I mean, it's like these people have no problem with like liberal Jews being blamed for like the as long it's like there's no real issue with that. And so
it's interesting the what I was thinking about in terms of the startup nation and the boycott, divestment, sanctions, and this recent circles and investigation. And I found this interview that the head of the Citizens Lab had done on Democracy Now! Back in 2017 when their NSO investigation. And it looks like that's how we know about the NSO Pegasus tools that are used to basically own people's phones, is via this investigation of the Citizens Lab with activists on the ground in Mexico, activists on the ground in UAE. The guy that they were working with in the UAE has been locked up since then. And it was a very interesting interview because Amy Goodman was asking the head of the Citizens Lab specifically about the Israeli government's role. And basically, she's like, okay, they give these tools over to all of these foreign actors, and potentially it's quote unquote slips into other hands if there's enough money on the table, such as I mentioned with the Mexican cartels. But she said, but what about the Israeli government? Aren't they sort of behind the technology? Are they also have access? And he tried to evade it. He evaded it once, and she re-asked it, and he evaded it again by saying, yeah, I think it's true. This is Israel question is very important. I think the Israeli people should look into this, and evading her point, which was a very important point, and she followed up on it multiple times. Some of the best questioning I've ever seen Amy Goodman actually do. She didn't actually answer the question ultimately. She didn't get to the answer, but she asked the question multiple times about, all right, is there a back door here? Doesn't the Israeli military intelligence that created Pegasus in the first place, let's be honest, I mean, these are corporate cutouts. That's the whole point of the Talpiot program, right? The Talpiot program is not just about a super collider of technology. That's part of it. It is definitely that, where and it's in the dynamics of it, where it started at the end of the 70s. Zohar Zisapel, his brother Yehuda Zisapel, they're a team. They are getting into technology, starting to create a bunch of technology. And then as that's happening, they create this Talpiot program, which is basically it's heading towards a technology special forces military intelligence program, right? And so what happens is they pick the sort of the cream of the crop in terms of their testing, and even some of the psychological testing type of stuff that's used in the corporate world. And around the academic world too. Some of it originates in Israel in terms of some of these assessment tests in terms of their young people coming up. But they identify the highest combination of IQ and EQ, but mainly those that are sort of strong team leaders, while also being strong potentially with sociopathic tendencies that you find being cultivated in intelligence agencies a lot. The ability to get, to basically deceive people, right? But that's combined with EQ, team leading skills, and IQ, such as research skills. And then you go through this program, and it's many, many years, 9 years ultimately. But you do your normal IDF services, but you choose where you want to go. But you also do basically a PhD program. And then afterwards, you choose what you want to do. And it's basically broken up into three. A third of people go into, sorry about the camera. I'm using this handy cam, Sony cam. You choose, a third choose to go into academia, continue in academia, which is very important because if you think about quantum computing, I pointed out before that the United States seems to have two public quantum computing centers, one of them being at the University of Southern California, teamed up with Lockheed, and it was run by an Israeli. And so that's academics, right? And China has just recently come out and said that they've created the fastest quantum computing platform in the world. They say that they're some trillion something levels beyond what Google has announced in terms of their quantum computing. And of course, that is where this cyber question gets truly deep and potentially very, very scary if we don't ethically grapple with it. Some very interesting stuff I just wanted to mention too. There's this a researcher at Google Artificial Intelligence who was just sort of pushed out, it looks like. And a lot of it's about, people of color politics in the workplace. And a lot of that, it looks serious in terms of her experience. But my sense is there's something deeper going on there about they were concerned about the approach to ethics that this investigator was involved in. and that there's something going on in the background of Google don't be evil, all of that kind of stuff. And remember too, there's this whole thing with the incoming team in terms of Biden, the West exec people. They all work with Google Jigsaw. Go look up Google Jigsaw. Jared Cohen running Google Jigsaw seems to be involved in actual kinetic covert operations around the world. So this question of Talpiot, let me just finish up on Talpiot and why it's connected to boycott, divestment, sanction. I mean, obviously on the surface, this whole question of Paul Singer starting up the whole idea of the startup nation concept in order to bring in the Israeli corporations to make it basically impossible to disentangle, thus making boycott, divestment, sanctions virtually impossible, which is what we're seeing at the state level, where they're basically trying to hook it up in such a deep way where it's, you want to boycott Israel? Oh, now our water dams are not going to have cybersecurity in the case of New York State. And when Greitens was in the governorship in Missouri, he went to Israel, met with Netanyahu, came back and started some kind of program linking up the Missouri National Guard directly with Israeli Defense Forces in training and then cyber stuff. So that is at the root of it. Is the point of this is to implicate so that it cannot be extricated, the binational relationship between the United States and Israel in a corporate fashion. So Talpiot, in finishing up the Talpiot program, it's divided up in three, the graduates. A third of the graduates go up into academia. And like I pointed out, that's not just publishing papers. That's also, we're talking about quantum computing. We're talking about biological investigations, biological warfare. Go look at the background, very strange background of the anthrax attacks in relationship to Israeli declared technology 5 years later around using silica in the presence of tin to make the anthrax much more spreadable. And so what you see is the quote unquote inside job of the anthrax attacks, where obviously it's a U.S. weapons laboratory anthrax strain, but then it looks like, to my mind, the evidence suggests that it's then encapsulated into an Israeli academically created delivery platform in terms of this silica, nanosilica in the presence of tin. And remember that whole background there, where the Israeli partisans who were at the same time generating the Iraq war were saying this is Saddam Hussein with the bentonite clay, with the Soviet supplied technology. And meanwhile, we've covered some of the background of the Israeli biological weapons program. Does have involvement with the Soviet and Chinese scientists brought in relationship to even things like ethno-specific bioweapons and all of that. You can find all kinds of quotes around them trying to design, the Israelis being accused of trying to design ethno-specific bioweapons for the Arab world, most specifically. So there's that. The academic, a third then go into basically keep going up the ladders of the military and or intelligence services. And then finally, and this is the big payoff, remember Netanyahu in that clip that we when we covered the Talpiot program, the clip where he's being interviewed by Mark Levin, another key figure here, obviously in Trump land, Trump world, Trump era. But in that interview with Netanyahu, Netanyahu makes it very explicit. He says it's a combination of Soviet science, the approach to Soviet science, long-term institutional characters, total servitude to the government by the scientists, total servitude with the potential weaponization of science, and most especially this long-term institutional dynamics towards projects, I think is sort of what he means by that. And then he says, combine that with Silicon Valley and America's, incredible unleashing of the powers of the firms. He's talking about the corporate element of the United States and the corporate element of Silicon Valley, where, yeah, the DARPA helped start the internet. The U.S. government helps launch Silicon Valley, but then it sort of takes its hand off at some level, and it's, allows the corporate sector to get going and lets Wall Street finance it and all that. And that's Netanyahu's big post 9/11 operation that he fulfills ultimately, is to fulfill the corporatization of his Soviet style science that goes way to the very beginning and before, really, of the Israeli state. And just one last thing I want to point out on this is that go look at the background of Victor Rothschild, as I pointed out again, in terms of the precursor to the science apparatus in the Jewish state before it's actually created as Israel, in terms of hooking up with Weizmann and then ultimately hooking up with Porton Downs, UK biowarfare, and then basically starting the first international bio-investment firm. So there is a lot there, and looks like he is this undiscovered Soviet agent, the missing piece of the Cambridge Circle of Spies, where Kim Philby is at the epicenter of it, basically pointing ultimately to the very likely compromise of the highest levels of U.S. counterintelligence, James Angleton, his close relationship to Philby, and then Angleton working the Israel desk. And so we are just now at the next level of this, where Talpiot as a corporate mole program, think Adalom at Microsoft Cloud App Security, and then the political move at the last moment to say, oh, now they're going to be in control of the Pentagon's cloud. Okay, that's what we're talking about. This level of interstitiality, of compromise between states, and basically from the Israelis to the United States, and that's what is actually behind these anti-BDS laws.
Man, you laid out a lot there, a lot of food for thought there, and some, and also I think you alluded to some of the other consequences of, even at a state level, where the consequences could become very serious for states that, in terms of some of the deals you were talking about, even involving like Eric Greitens as governor of Missouri, and some of the deals that are being undertaken, some very serious potential consequences at a state level for states that are a bit too willing to embrace or not embrace the opposition to the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. So some things to look out for there. And the interview, by the way, that you mentioned was with Ron Diebert from Citizens Lab. And it's a very interesting interview because it's the first I'd heard of Citizens Lab, the first I'd heard of this investigation. And it went into a number of areas, because even outside of the unwillingness to really talk about the directness of the Israeli aspect of this operation, there's a lot of light shed on that. But it was interesting because this is an interview that not only covered this NSO group role in what was going on in Mexico, but also really got into depth. Like this Citizens Lab is very much on the ball as far as like the Russian side of this whole of this bigger, a lot of these bigger global scale ops that are going on. And it mentions some this interview, by the way, from July 2017, we'll link to it in our show notes, brings up some very interesting information about WikiLeaks and about
not WikiLeaks necessarily.
Well, it raises some potential. I mean, even the mentioning WikiLeaks,
the implications for WikiLeaks are definitely there. But he talks about David Satter, David Satter, who wrote the book. The less you know, the better you sleep, I think it's called. We'll break it out again, and basically got chased out of Russia. And what's his name again? You said this guy?
Ron Diebert.
Ron Diebert. He says
D-E-R-T.
that he was hacked, that Satter, this sort of one of the most sort of critical of the Russian deep state, really. His book is a lot about the rise of post-Soviet Russian leadership such as Yeltsin and Putin, and he deals with false flag terrorism, the apartment bombings, and all of that. So you could see why he, in a Russian context, he is persona non grata. He is an enemy of the state. And what Citizen Lab found was that he was hacked by one of these links, and this is what they said in terms of comparing it to the DNC leaks and the WikiLeaks release of it. That you could see a parallel process here. Is that he said he was sent a phishing email to reset his password, which is supposedly what happened with what's his name, John Podesta. That's how his emails were received. But then what they said was they then looked, and then that disinformation or manufactured emails were then inserted into the hacked emails, and in a way that showed that he was responsible for working with Navalny. David Satter, the journalist, was working with Navalny. Was actually a CIA operation very directly, and that all of these very specific emails were manufactured. So it's interesting. That is what some people have said about WikiLeaks, that it was a combination of hacked emails, that then there were manufactured emails, such as disinformation, that was inserted into it. And in terms of WikiLeaks, basically they received the load. They received the dump or the load. It depends on who's saying it. Trump would talk about dumps. I don't know. Bill Clinton would talk about loads, maybe. But they received the package, let's call it, of the emails. But it's very likely already been it's been disinformation. It's been inserted with false emails to sexy up the joint, really. And so it's very possible that is what people say. Well, WikiLeaks has never been found to have released has never had to retract it. Mm-hmm. Now, we don't know, like none of the victims of the hacks have ever come forward to say, well, that wasn't true. I don't think. But that should be something that could be looked at in terms of, at the very least, as a tactic. And final point is that what you were referencing, what Diebert had said, was they recognized methods, the methodology, and certain websites and certain modes of operating that looked at parallel fashion between the Satter hack and the DNC 2016 hacks.
Yeah, there's a lot to unravel and unpeel with that. And I think that this is an interesting diversity of multiple levels of interest that I think really I think by following into this example and really looking into some of this research, seems to perhaps really make some more sense of the global aspect of this by bringing in multiple elements of this, because obviously we've known like NSO Group links multiple entities with all this, and then even the Russian centric aspect of this whole operation. And it's very interesting to see some serious analysis and research on multiple fronts of this, because see, like a lot of the research is one area or the other. Like there's a lot of people focused on the Russian specific aspects, trying to make sense of whatever's going on with the Russian aspect is, and obviously a lot of very serious research into things such as NSO Group and the more Israeli centric things such as NSO Group or Black Cube, or how some of these entities operate. But I can't think of very many examples where there's been a real clear attempt to try to like tie and bind all of these together. So perhaps it's the beginning of an inquiry to lead us down some paths to some answers that could lead us into that direction of tying these things together, because indirectly there's clearly some symmetry, but even more directly, and even if it's not direct but it's somewhat indirect, you can see patterns in how these things evolve in multiple angles and elements. And so this is, just really interesting, and
it is interesting.
It's new inquiry
for sure. And this cutout aspect of that was being identified, where and I think this was a fair point that Diebert was making, that there is this, and we've made similar points, that there is this aspect of where the Russian deep state, as it exists, as it works, is there's a sort of horizontalism, actually, you might call it, in terms of the left terminology, Occupy terminology, anarchist terminology, in that it is the oligarchs, the commanding heights of the government, and then the gangsters are sort of operating on a spread out team in a certain way, in a way where the commanding heights of the United States deep state is way more vertical and way more, you get into government offices at the highest levels in terms of the command and control of military intelligence kind of apparatus in a way that is a little that it seems to work more in network logic in Russia. And the way that it was described was that there's almost always some kind of criminal cutout for the kind of, or at least a criminal partner potentially in the kind of operations that potentially for a Russian deep state element that in the West would be maybe totally managed by the government, done by the government through and through ultimately. And of course he's leaving aside the whole history of the relationship of the CIA and the drug running and all of that. But to an extent, I think it's largely true that the hierarchy is a little stronger in relationship to the United States command and control in terms of the relationship with the deep state. And as I've supposed that the Trump years were basically the inversion of that in many ways. And that's why it comes along with the transnationalism of the deep state that backed Trump. It was not just American. It was very, very foreign. It was very, very Russian. It was very, very Israeli and more generally Middle Eastern. There was even some European dynamics. And if you think about the Hungarian sort of thoroughfare in many ways, and Hungary operating the same way that the Netherlands what's it called? The airport, Schiphol, I think it's called. The airport in the Netherlands is seen as the epicenter of Israeli intelligence in Europe. Similarly, the Budapest in Hungary is seen as the operational epicenter of Russian intelligence in a European sphere. And so go look at the Budapest Bridge articles again and read them in that capacity. And then go look at what I mentioned in our last recording about the ambassador, the Hungarian ambassador to the United States under the Trump years was a former head of Teva Israeli Pharmaceuticals in the Hungarian sphere. So there's a lot going on there. And actually there's very likely even tie-ins to COVID that folks might want to try to ascertain if you think about the relationship of COVID and opiates and fentanyl and northern Italy and all of that. You go look into some of that and see what you can find. All right, so Greg, should we move on to this next clip, or there's some other stuff we should digest here?
No, I think we've had quite a lengthy conversation on these topics, and you could. Hypothetically, we could speak forever about these things and never run out of things to talk about. But unfortunately, we've only got a finite amount of time. So I think we should move on into this this clip. This is going to be your question to U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer at the Dole Institute.
Yes.
Regarding China-Israel relationship.
This took a whole lot of battles to even be able to be allowed to ask this question. I was, throughout large portions of this year, I was trying to ask questions in the Dole online YouTube forum, and they had censored me basically and put me into some kind of penalty box unfairly. And I had to email the director of the Dole Institute ultimately, and he finally got me unfrozen, and they finally asked a few of my questions. I will point out in this that he actually left out the key factual context of my question. Thus, Lighthizer, the U.S. trade representative under Trump, key figure in terms of the whole question of China. And look into his background. He's Skadden Arps. This is the Skadden Arps Steel U.S. Steel representative crew. But remember, Skadden Arps is also the key Israeli high technology law firm in the world, probably, in terms of incorporating Israeli high tech into the West and the United States. But also, Skadden Arps is also the epicenter of the highest levels of the U.S. Pollard defense legal networks. What's the dude's name? Do you remember the guy that I'm thinking of, Greg? He was the head of the ADL during the Pollard thing, I think.
Just 1 second.
And he was the head of.
Here, just give me a second. The name will come to me.
Okay, he was the head of every powerful Jewish Zionist organization you can think of. B'nai B'rith. He was the head of B'nai B'rith too. And he was all the Skadden Arps was originally where the second 9/11 paymaster comes out of. The first 9/11 paymaster being Kenneth Feinberg, I believe is that right? Kenneth Feinberg, I think that's what his name is.
Yes, Kenneth. Yes,
and he's
correct.
The paymaster for everything from the Zapruder film in relationship to Time, I think, at some point, on up to all kinds of deep events, such as the oil spill. Even Obama had commented on the oil spill. At some point, we'll talk a little bit more about Obama's legacy and his book and his tour and the big point where he's making his 3 point. That's what I do. There's such a narcissist dude, a very, and when he got into power, he became a dangerous narcissist. And all of the whole, like, Obama, the Democrat devil or the Muslim traitor was all a way of avoiding the actual serious criticism of Obama himself. The last thing on top, while I remember it, is that if you go look at here, this is what originally struck in my mind about this question of the Circles investigation and how they were using checkpoint firewall hardware straight out of highest levels of Israeli military intelligence as their fixed infrastructure point to run their man-in-the-middle attacks software in relationship to hijacking SMS and all that. But go look into the question of, and where did I read this last? I can't have a hard time keeping track of all these sources. But there's some reference to this maybe in James Bamford's book, the post 9/11 book about the NSA, and those 2 chapters about the outsourcing of NSA surveillance to Israeli companies. But there's definitely some mention there. But there's another one where it talks about how upwards of 90% more.
Jeremy.
Yeah.
Kenneth Bialkin.
Thank you, Greg. I appreciate it. Yes. Greg, the fact master. I appreciate it. The references. Kenneth Bialkin. Go look into Kenneth Bialkin. Whoo, boy. That is a serious operator if you ever in Skadden Arps. And so Lighthizer comes out of Skadden Arps. But go look at the relationship of Israeli communications technology, telecom communication technology, and China. And you will see that they are all up in it. And my point is that this is what Netanyahu really, really means when he says, you will boycott us, we'll boycott you. He's not just talking to Esther Kuntz, the Mennonite math teacher of morality in Kansas, in the highlands of Kansas or something like that. No, he's talking to China. he's talking to the United States. Yeah.
He's talking to states and countries that, not only will we go after individuals, but we have ways of, we have our ways of punishing you if you don't go along with what we want. I mean,
he's like, we installed all of our Radware routers and our Naris, switches and all of that right up into the heart of all of your major infrastructure all around the world. We're in the epicenter, and we don't own it all, but they're top 3. They're after China and the United States, basically. Maybe the United States and China in terms of certain technology, and then Israel around the big 21st century cyber technology that the average person is going to be using. And obviously this Circles story shows that they're willing to use it, or at least allow it to be utilized. There's obviously some kind of back end probably planned into their checkpoint firewalls where they can then be used by these future software attackers.
Yeah, and then it raises the question of another potential question of like, if these interests are truly unhappy with, say, new administration coming into power, I mean, what kind of things could possibly be done to express that? I don't know, but I mean, in this regard of like what we're talking about here with like these with this very real power combined with this ability to use that power, I mean, it's just something to ponder and to consider. So
Yeah, and I think that it's pretty clear at this point that the incoming administration is not situated at all to rock any boat in relationship to Israel. And sure, like, maybe there will be some kind of Obama, Iran situation, and that was substantial. Obviously, the geopolitics of that were semi-substantial, and the politics of that were quite substantial in terms of Netanyahu taking over the Congress in a high, like, think about New Jersey. New Jersey comes in to basically overthrow all diplomatic norms in relationship to the most powerful country in the world. Like, New Jersey steps in, basically, no, we're taking over this this Congress. That's basically what it is. If you think about it as landscape and all of that. So I would say that will explain why there will not be any rocking of the boat. So, but what it means is if we the people in the United States, let's say, if we're serious about actually a real American policy, both domestic and foreign, it's going to have to be with this perspective about this very, very dangerous, quote unquote, relationship that has been created with this global cyber power, Israel, which is also the known locus of the biggest highest level billionaire gangsters in the world. All of the Red Mafia have the passports, and plus it's this fixed point of Israeli military intelligence in terms of these long-term programs and the technology. So that's going to have to be looked at very frontally if we, the people, are going to have a real American policy. And of course, it'll have to be based on a real domestic policy where we begin to recreate our technology fully at home. And I would say we need to do it fully from the ground up, from we, the people, on up, with with contribution from our governments. But it's going to have to be a whole new look at this. All right, let me go to this other clip here.
And just real quick, what I meant was obviously Biden Harris, there's not going to be much of like there's not going to be much done in terms of the the quote special relationship between the U.S. and Israel. But, we talked about being from perhaps the more liberal, liberal foreign policy establishment consensus on Israel. And that could very well be if there's any serious moves in this regard, it could be a threat to what we've seen over the last 4 years with the complete shifting of like U.S. Foreign policy from this direction of what we've talked about for the longest time. We're like, the Americans are in the driver's seat. Yes, Israel's this powerful entity. Its lobby can effectively dominate and own our Congress to the point that it makes decisions for Israel that are very negative even for our own national security at times. But the Americans have long been in the driver's seat in terms of this relationship. And there could be, if like the Netanyahu from like even the long-term asset or agent of certain interests we've talked about over the years sees this as a threat, then I mean they very well could take some action to undermine this incoming administration as much as possible, as good as it will actually be for Israel in terms of like the quote special relationship and maintaining all of the perks that Israel gets from like its from like the special relationship with the Americans, so to speak.
Yes.
And that very well may not happen either under Biden Harris. I mean, we'll see.
Well, but I definitely agree with that. Is definitely that there's that short-term dynamic in terms of this incoming administration, in terms of just the basics of geopolitics, in terms of the Iranian deal or the reestablishment of the U.S. In relationship to foreign relationships, the allies, and all of that. But so I think the bigger structural picture is that this represents the ongoing thinks bar quote of Netanyahu and this the whole question of the plan of the shift away from the United States, from the paleo neocons, and it's the sort of U.S. and Israel as the sort of partners in the unipolar moment. Maybe add on some kind of Tony Blairized UK in that whole dynamic too. To the point of where they are, it's not just being allowed to happen. It's not just happening. It's being allowed to happen in terms of the pulling away from the bipartisan Israeli consensus, as you mentioned before, Greg. You know, I mean, in terms of like where it used to be, you could count on both the Republicans and the Democrats to support this relationship. But as you see the turning away from that, it could be that that's being allowed to happen from an Israeli context as this larger quote unquote multipolar shift happens. So maybe you're right, Greg. Maybe just the intent to recreate certain American alliances that obviously the players that are being announced in the Biden administration obviously represent some kind of like, no, come on, we're Americans here. Who's the superpower again? Remember that Bill Clinton quote when he dealt with the Israelis.
I thought we were the
all I get out of this is some blue dress.
You know, and George H.W. Bush was just one small man fighting a huge lobby. Poor guy. All right. Well, let's. I guess we should get to this question to the Robert Lighthizer at the Dole Institute regarding the China-Israel relationship.
All right. So we will see here. All right. I'm going to point out here on the side. I just want to first read. I'm just going to read my question actually as I wrote it, and then you'll see the way that it's asked. Okay. So it's. And also I'm going to make sure that I get our faces out of the way before. Sorry, I'm trying to figure this all out here, Greg. I apologize.
That's fine, no problem.
I don't know what I'm doing.
Just
okay,
one.
Here we go.
Just one little lonely guy going up against the Israel lobby.
Okay, I'm just going to try to shrink us down again. There we go. We're getting shrunk down again, Greg. All right, I'm going to put us right there.
Looks good.
All right, you can see Dole Institute United States Trade Representative Robert E. Lighthizer streamed live on November 19th, 2020. And my question was, while Skadden Arp's big steel reps served Trump policy on resource and agriculture trade skirmishes with China, U.S. high technology industrial vulnerability and foreign penetration was exacerbated. What trade policy should we, the people, consider to address the fact that core U.S. industrial high-tech R&D functions, including Microsoft software and Intel and now Apple hardware chipsets, parenthetically, Apple, the new Apple M1 chipsets are apparently designed in Israel. And now Apple hardware chipsets have been exported to Israel's military intelligence-born, quote, Silicon Wadi, which is deeply and dangerously in bed with China, marrying, quote, Israeli technology to Chinese capacity, unquote. That's the question. Now let's see how this goes down here.
Okay, I have another one that's rather long from Jeremy, but I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit. He speaks and asks about the strong connection between major technology in the United States and Israel's military intelligence, and is concerned about the closeness of Israel to China. Is that something that we should be concerned about in terms of technology?
Well, I don't know quite where Jeremy's going with the question, but let me just talk a little bit about it. First of all, Israel's a very close ally of the United States. That's one point. Number two is Israel's very, very good in the technology space. And there's a lot of overlap between U.S. and Israeli countries in the technology space.
Countries?
There also is a concern that we have not just with Israeli companies, but also with American companies, as well as European and other world companies. I mean, other countries.
I want to back it up. Let me back it up without our faces.
Israeli good in the technology space. But let me.
Closeness Israel to China. Is that something that we should be concerned about in terms of technology?
Well, I don't know quite where Jeremy's going with the question, but let me just talk a little bit about it. First of all, Israel's a very close ally of the United States. That's one point. Number two is Israel's very, very good in the technology space. And there's a lot of overlap between U.S. and Israeli countries in the technology space. There also is a concern that we have, not just with Israeli companies, but also with American companies, as well as European and other world companies. Other countries, companies in other countries, that we're losing technology to China. So that space generally, yeah, I would be concerned. I wouldn't necessarily single out Israel over other countries, but that's an area that I do worry about. Technology transfer, failure to protect intellectual property, technology theft. All of those areas are enormous importance to the United States and something we worry about with respect to every country, every company in the world.
All right. Interesting.
Okay.
That was the America, one of our greatest allies. That's the Jim Jordan answer in response to being grilled about the relationship between Jeffrey Epstein, Israeli intelligence, and Russian organized crime figures. And yeah, although he may have been, old Jim Jordan may have received a tongue lashing for referring to Israel as one of our greatest allies. So anyway, let's talk. Okay, so your thoughts on the question and his response. And I mean, obviously I saw some obviously a very concerted attempt to not answer the question directly, among at the very least. So
well, it was interesting because the way it was asked, he sort of answered it almost fairly in terms of the way it was asked, because I mean the way that Lacey actually asked it to him.
Sure.
Because he didn't include the context, which I had pointed out, which was and it would have fit into what is ostensibly the Trump policy, which is, bring back industry to the United States, which was the point of my question in the first place, is what do we need to do in relationship to the outsourcing of our high technology in terms of these chipsets and Microsoft software to Israel. So that's the key precursor that was not talked about. Without that precursor, it's basically, yeah, sure, okay, countries share technology, technology is leaking, and yes, he played down the specialness of the U.S.-Israeli relationship, which is he admitted the specialness at some level, while then also denying that if there's a upside to the special relationship, there's obviously a downside to the special relationship, which has to do with the technology transfer, as he called it, and the concerns of that. But I thought it was very interesting. He was very concerned. He was, he started mistaking countries and companies over and over again, a lot of hemming and hawing. But, he couldn't deny the basic, intent of it, that we have to worry about our technology escaping. But my larger policy point there, which was the pretext of the question, was what should we do here in the United States of America in terms of so that we are not creating our chipsets in Israel, which is a known backdoor to China.
And this brings up some interesting questions because with all of the constant non-stop saber rattling towards China, and we've talked so much about it, at the very least the rhetorical hawkishness towards China. I mean, coming down all around all over the place. And of course, you mentioned Director of National Intelligence Ratcliffe earlier in this. He's being celebrated for this op-ed he wrote in the Wall Street Journal about the nature of the China threat. China, the China threat. When meanwhile, under the guise of like this, let's let's punish China to bring our prosperity back, right? I mean, you do have this backdoor going on, and it's like something that, it does not get talked about. And once again, as we talked about in our live stream on Saturday, this is one of the downsides, or on our last recording, this is one of the problems with not being forthright and addressing like the actual China threat that is outside of like the way like these weaponized controlled opposition rhetorical hawks towards China characterize and frame it. I mean, this is one of the consequences of that, is that this very real backdoor under the rhetorically the idea of like bringing our prosperity back and making America first again, is that under all of this, I mean, you do have this U.S. to China aspect of things, but the Israeli component of all of this in all of this treachery that's talked about in this economic and technological all of these dynamics take place, it's never discussed, and certainly never in these circles, but also within very serious circles of people who probably should be having these conversations. And in another reality where there wasn't such a large scale, in so many ways, propaganda war going on, where any criticism whatsoever of like any type of Chinese ambitions, and much less the Israeli components to these Chinese ambitions, is automatically decried as just you're an apologist for American empire, and you're a xenophobe, or you're reliving the Cold War. And so this is another consequence of that, is in anything from a question to the U.S. trade representative at the Dole Institute to a conversation hosted by, say, the Gray Zone Project. You just can't talk about these things. You're not expected to.
Oh yeah. And I'd say that is pointing out too that this Israel question is the strategic leverage point politically in terms of this larger conversation. It's also at the center of the content of that conversation. But it's so obvious, like even this story that just came out about Representative Eric Swalwell's relationship with this Chinese intelligence agent that apparently then worked with the FBI once they told him that she was a Chinese intelligence agent. There's some questionable stuff going on, though, because he's in denial of some stuff going on. And so this is going to become front and center, because it is the case that the level of the talking of industrial espionage about China, a lot of it's true. But the missing factor of Israel, when you really deal with the background here, because think about, we didn't talk about that, but of course, Tapiot as a international corporate espionage operation is not only in terms of aggressive, in terms of inserting itself into these key dynamics, in terms of think about it as being bought up or swallowed as a pill into these big U.S. corporate cyber companies, like Adalom into Microsoft, for example. But it's also obviously there is a backdoor back to with the technology, with the intellectual property, with that whole scan of IP that is really emphasized around how China is the big threat to IP, intellectual property. Think about the level of penetration by Israel when we even talked about the head of the newly created Cyber Defense Command at the NSA. I can't remember her name now, but married to AIPAC official. Go look at the parents, the billionaire dad, and this whole Kushner COVID emolument. Neuberger, right?
Yes,
or Neuberger. And Neuberger.
Neuberger, Neuberger.
I mean, we're not seeing Chinese. It reminds me of the stuff after 9/11. Like we're not seeing the Chinese, those with loyalties to the Chinese government running the 7th floor of the State Department, right? As we are seeing these other partisan elements to another country, Israel, in these key commanding areas potentially. And I'm not making the allegation that Ann Neuberger is an Israeli operative per se. I'm not saying it's possible. I mean, look, the architecture is there for that in terms of her trip right after her graduation from high school to Israel, long summer there. That is like, think about what we talked about, Michael Makovsky. It's right after high school. He goes to Israel and doesn't come back, right? He's basically there for 5 years. He's at the right hand of Shimon Peres, the godfather of the Israeli nuclear program. The godfather of Arnon Milchan, billionaire Hollywood producer of JFK and long-term Israeli weapons procurement espionage agent. By the way, I just saw in the book that we dealt with a little bit, the Milchan biography. I forget what it's called. Confidential, that he was not only the procurer of nuclear, he was not only a nuclear intelligence agent, he was also read into all of the missing pieces of the high-level Israeli weapons program, including chemical and biological. All right. And what the book says is that he would be told what were the missing components of these biological and chemical weapons in addition to the nuclear programs, and then he would procure them. All right. So I want people to go look in the background of this anthrax program too, in that kind of context where you see the mother of Michael Kadar. Remember this Michael Kadar, very strange story, comes with the rise of Trump, where the Jewish community centers around the continent, around the world, really, there's Australia aspects where are getting bomb threats on the regular. Finally, it's found that it's coming from Israel, but then this kid, Kadar, it's supposedly he actually was in the United States and then is brought to Israel to be arrested potentially. But the mother, apparently, of this guy is Tamar Kadar, who works at the Israeli biological infrastructure. It's a biological weapons research laboratory. Nez Ziona, I think, is where the one that she works at. And then, by the way, I looked up the background here, and she was in the U.S. in the early 90s. She, to this day, she seems to be writing papers, high-level chemical, biochemistry papers, biology papers that are apparently sponsored by the highest levels of the U.S. Army to this day. But she was in the U.S. in the early 90s doing some kind of postdoc exchange program related to the U.S. Army. This is the exact same time, early 90s, maybe 90, 91, somewhere in there, where the so-called Camel Club, remember the whole background of Michael's Dr. Philip Zach, he and his apparent girlfriend or some of their friends were racially harassing one of the Egyptian born scientists at US AMRID, I think it was. And then someone tries to frame him in the wake of September 11th and the anthrax attacks and that whole background that I pointed to before in terms of the nanosilica and all of that. And she was there at this exact time. I don't know exactly if she was in US AMRID per se, but this is also the time when there is video of people being at labs when they shouldn't have been there and things being procured. So I'm not saying there's a direct. I mean, think about the timeline of this. It's interesting because that's
logical. It's a fair question to raise. I mean.
And I'm not saying Milchan himself was involved in that per se, but that this is of course the way that any high level military intelligence weapons program would think. All right, we are missing a crucial piece of something, and we're going to go get it, right? And no one is better situated than Israeli military intelligence to be able to do that in an American capacity, really. And think about this is the exact time period of Milchan and Oliver Stone. I just said Oliver Stone and JFK doing their film. So I just think it's a very interesting timeline.
Yeah, without question, it's an extremely interesting timeline. And something I was thinking about with regards to China and the Biden-Harris administration is that in a Biden-Harris administration, much like foreign collusion with Russia, right, was what we heard about constantly under Trump. You could see that same thing with the case for China getting by. I think you very well could see that, and it'd be very interesting if like the shoe is reversed on the other foot, right? And instead of who we've identified as like the Israeli-centric cover-up artist in terms of the democratic investigation into Trump and foreign collusion, such as um, um, Schiff and such as Adam Schiff and the whole Schiff, Nadler, Cohen triumvirate, with also a Nancy Pelosi as House Speaker, who actually tried to stop impeachment proceeding, but the public pressure for it was like too high that like there had to at least be a show trial. And so it would be interesting, say like the roles are reversed. Instead of say Schiff, we have Congressman Jordan leading a congressional Republican investigation into the Biden collusion with China. Will these same prevailing interests to this same foreign country actually prevent or limit said investigation? I mean, and with like, and obviously outside of there's obviously going to be extremely weaponized narrative to the whole Biden here. If this happens, this is hypothetically, but it's a realistic scenario. A serious Republican-led investigation into like the Biden's
in China. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, you're already seeing the seeds for that being planted, but
Trump, Russia, Biden, China. Yeah.
But like, Senator
and Israel will be nowhere to be found, and Israeli partisans will be there making sure that all the angles are not covered.
Yeah. So instead of an Adam Schiff, it'll be a Congressman Jim Jordan and a few other people. Right. But ultimately, like any type of serious inquiries will, whatever serious inquiry there would be to it, or serious level of like actual merits would be undermined, and ultimately would actually not be completely filled in, because of there will once again be a complete like unwillingness to go after and explore the Israeli role in all things related to this. So there could be a similar dynamic to the Trump investigations with the incoming Biden-Harris administration. So it'd be interesting if the shoe was reversed in that regard, and I think you very well could see that happen.
I could see it. It's a good scenario building, Greg.
And also like a combination of also like and also this also is at play too, like an actual exaggeration in a very weaponized, borderline conspiratorial manner regarding like I almost like a Soros like boogeyman exaggeration of all things China, whereas like China's literally there could be some very, very like ridiculous theories concocted, but at the same time, whatever legitimacy or actual merits there are completely being undermined by like an unwillingness to look into America's greatest ally, so to speak.
Yeah, our greatest. So you're right. I think Jim Jordan got tongue lashing for what'd you say for not calling it the greatest?
One of our greatest.
Yeah. What, Jim? Jim, with these kinds of firms, you call us just one of your greatest allies?
Yeah. Right.
All right. I'm going to finish my elderberry whiskey for the evening. It's one of the last good contributions that Cliff High gave to the public interest this pandemic year. Was it's a good drink. It's a good combo. It's elderberry, vitamin C, a little bit of chaga, mushroom powder, and whiskey. And
nice.
I like to drink it sometimes. It's good.
It's interesting.
It's a little bit late to be finishing it.
It might help you sleep though.
Yeah, that's true.
All right. Well, I think we've gone a good while here. Do you have anything else you wanted to touch on before we begin to wrap up here?
No.
All right. Well, on that note, I think
cheers, everybody.
Bring this to an end, and I hope this was informative. Just wanted to play our recent calls. A lot of talking in between, but I think we, hopefully the the points of our respective calls, the call-ins, and questions were addressed. And so anyway, until next time, we'll hopefully do another recording here here fairly soon. Definitely, I think definitely like to put something out within the next 7 days or so. But we'll be back with more, and we'll just keep an eye on the events as they go down right now. Like there is an aspect of this. It does seem to be a lot of this for show, perhaps a grift going on. But at the same time, I mean, there's some very dangerous consequences to this election response.
At the very least, it's hybrid warfare. At the very least, it's hybrid warfare at a mass scale.
With elements that the things that people said could never happen here actually becoming things we really need to ponder the possibility of actually happening here. So,
plus get our act together in terms of the people that birthed the internet and the digital age. We might be able to make our own computer chips again. Come on, dude. Plus, then we have to reform agriculture in the main, restoration agriculture. There's big things to deal with that go way beyond the stupid Michael Flynn and all of that crap. And so, somehow we got to get past the Trump, Russia, the Biden, China to be able to deal with we the American people. And what the heck are we building here? And let's get to it pretty quickly here. Greg, is it cool? It's okay if I play? I want to play John Swin's cartoon video again, and then our Nils Maskill's.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it. A huge thanks to John Swin, by the way, for all that he's doing, and check out his channel, Expose the Enemy, and some of his recent documentaries, including I believe he's got partial Max Fisher documentary, as well as his recent video on General Paul Vallely. So,
and he's got some really interesting research that he's been doing in the pipeline that will really show some deep history that has not really been dealt with. So watch for that. All right.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, folks out there. Next time, try to read comments as the live stream's happening. It's very difficult to be able to do all this at the same time. No expert here, but we'll get to it. We'll get to it eventually.
Yeah, John Brisson's mastered the art of reading comments as he goes along.
I got to figure out where to put them, and it's just okay. Well, we'll figure it out as we keep moving here. But we are moving into the YouTube era. AnteDote able to live stream finally every so often. Okay.
All right. Thanks, Jeremy.
All right. Thank you, Greg. All right. Here's the cartoon, and then I'll play the Nils Maskills. Go look up Nils Maskills freestyles, dude. That dude's serious, man. And John Swin just wrecking them on the informational front. All right. Peace out, everybody.
We must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the... We must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to... shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
Huh? What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No collusion! Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
What up, world? My name is Nils Maskills. I'm the leader of the Yarun Liberation Organization. And you're listening to my favorite podcast in the whole world, the AnteDote.